few preliminary comments. First is that Codman died and was buried in an unmarked grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery as a pauper. So he didn't exactly have a fantastic life, but he contributed an enormous amount. And one of the things, if you mention his name, point out is that most people that have a vision, most people that are ahead of their time, are generally not appreciated while they're there. Okay, and he was a perfect example of that. Now, that's not me. So I want to take you on a bit of a journey. This is a personal presentation because I'm going to share with you my story, and then I'm going to share with you some case studies. At the end, I'm not going to talk specifically about shoulder surgery at all. I'm going to talk about orthopedic surgeons. I'm going to talk about concepts of, well, a variety of things, including culture and innovation. So I'm going to ask you two questions. I'm not going to make anybody answer them. The first question is, what do you want to be when you grow up? Okay. What do you want your life to be? You want to be doing cases and living in a nice place like this is beautiful here? Or do you want more? Or maybe you don't know. And the point being that I tell my kids that I'm, and I told my wife the other day, I said that, I'm not grown up yet. In fact, she said, well, you're learning to ask all the right questions. And I said, and I will forever until I'm done. Because asking questions leads you to change what you're doing, and you never, ever, ever burn out. That's the first thing. The second one is, how many of you think you're innovative? Do you even think what innovation is? And I'll share with you a study we just completed at Harvard Business School about what orthopedic surgeons think of themselves and their organization and the question of innovation. And that will be something I'm pretty sure you probably won't get that from most others. So this was a grand rounds I did in 2022. This was a virtual grand rounds. Those who are interested in these kinds of things, this has a lot to do with the soft side of life, if you will. It's called Outside the OR, How Will You Measure Your Life? It's based on the concepts of Clayton Christensen, the late, great Clayton Christensen, who was a enormously important professor at Harvard Business School. And you can find that on ViewMedi. You can also find that on YouTube, frankly. So when I went to Harvard Business School, I found this magazine of Harvard Business Review in my living group area. And it says the hard truth about innovation. It's one part creativity, one part discipline. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And when it was all done, I said, well, how can I apply this where I live? And so the first lecture I gave on this, and this is an extension of that, was entitled Innovation in Orthopedic Shoulder Care, because it was about shoulder principally, and the context and culture and creativity that allowed it. And more importantly, how do you innovate yourself and others? And to what degree is technology involved in care delivery and business models? Because all of these blend together to making a difference in what you do, if that's indeed what you want to do. And so this title, Who Has the DNA to Innovate, is from Clayton Christensen's work. I'll explain in a minute who he is. And Innovation Happens Here is on the homepage of the Mass General Brigham website. And innovation, the problem is, it's great. You turn on a light, but it also blows up sometimes. And so you have to be willing to take risk, which is something we don't like to do in academic medical centers. So the part two of my talk is really what, where, how, and for whom. And there's lots of questions here, but that's important because that's what innovation is about. Now, conflicts, I have a lot of conflicts. These are all the different countries I collaborate with and innovations I've been involved in and startup companies. This is a sort of a breakdown. I've started 3 different organizations: the Boston Shoulder Institute, New England Shoulder Elbow Society, the Codman Shoulder Society. I can fill in the blanks on those in a bit. They're all non-for-profit. I have significant conflicts with companies that have helped design many, many implants. And in the early years of arthroscopy, I had a lot to do with designing those things, and et cetera. Again, I won't talk about most of that. I will, however, give you a case study of 2 companies. One is Imiscap and one is ViewMedi, both of which I have had a significant role in. Now, part of this is a story of when you grow up and you become an orthopedic surgeon and then maybe you want to do something different. That's called a pivot, pivoting in your career. And it was Warren Buffett who said, never test the depth of the river with both feet. And so pivot is keeping one foot planted and exploring other things so that you have a solid foundation before you decide to do something else. And that's just, if you remember anything, don't take a risk without being ready to take the risk. Too many people fail and then they don't have anything to fall back on. This is just for my LinkedIn page. We post a lot about these ideas there, just things that I like to think. This is a quote from Einstein: try not to become a man of success, but a man of value. And the purpose of my career is to improve the value delivered to all my customers, is a difficult word, but they're patients and collaborators, but people I work with. Now, in the early part of my career, and still to some degree, I had a lot of fellows. And I thought about that and the educational role that I played. I realized that the currency in education is our return on our investment based on the success of our students. And so Eric's a perfect example. And there are many more names that I could name drop for you who decades ago were my fellows. And it was my privilege to be able to influence the talent that came through the door, because they had that talent before they came to me. All I did was help mentor them to make the most of it. And so there have been many, many, many fellows over the years. It's actually more than 35 years now. I'm going into my fourth decade. And some faces you may recognize here. And to quote Codman, who we started this talk with, he said, "I realized it was the approval of my students rather than my peers, which was the greatest value." And I can tell you something interesting. Many of the companies in which I now work were created by some of my fellows who were founders, who invited me to come on board with them. And as a consequence, I can tell you this: business is built on relationships, period. And the relationships we build for the favors we do invariably come back in a good way. Just some more images of different folks here. So why did I become a doctor? And most importantly, why did I become an orthopedic surgeon? I come from 4 generations of doctors. It's my grandmother there with me as a baby with a dog. She was the first woman to graduate from medical school in the state of Ohio. My great uncle, who's not pictured here because I don't have a picture of him, knew the Mayo brothers personally. My mother was a doctor. My father was kind of an adventurous guy. There's an open wing airplane. He was a pilot for many years. And then my grandparents as well. So of course I had expectations, right? So these are my kids, with one with a husband, one with a boyfriend. And I can tell you that this one here does financial strategy for Google. This one here used to work for BCG, and now she's a mother and I'm a grandfather. This one here does VC in healthcare. And this one here does private equity in healthcare and recently vetted one of my companies. The closest they got to healthcare was business. They all decided, not for me. And that's a gift you give your kids. You let them do what they want to do, but they stayed connected and actually are part of my network, which has been great because I learn all the time from them about the things I need to understand as an entrepreneur. My wife is the attractive blonde there in the center. And then behind my daughter, there's her boyfriend, who's in hedge funds at Blackstone, and then my daughter's husband here, who works in Florida. So in 2012, I took my first executive class at Harvard Business School. I learned from Michael Porter and Robert Kaplan, names you may or may not know. I was very interested in what we talked about was the economics. So they wrote, this is one of the many articles they wrote, solving the cost crisis in healthcare. Michael became a mentor to me, and Bob Kaplan actually a collaborator. Bob is now emeritus and Michael is retired. And this was all about outcomes plus cost, because that's value. And most of you probably have no idea what anything you do really costs. And the reality is, you can't have value without knowing what things cost. Then in 2015, I took this course, executive program at Harvard Business School, from Regina Herzlinger, who's known as the godmother of healthcare. And she wrote this article, Why Innovation in Healthcare is So Hard. And this great book, Who Killed Healthcare, which is about healthcare around the world. And then I went to Harvard Business School in 2017 to 2019 for the executive program. These are many of my professors. And then in 2020, Clayton Christensen had sadly passed already, but he introduced the concept of disruptive innovation. And what is that? What is disruptive? We'll talk about that a little bit. And I was really struck by that. And many of the books he wrote, like The Innovator's Prescription, published in 2008, about how to provide value care to benefit everybody, which has been redone many times. There's a Christensen Institute that I worked with too recently. So back to Codman. Codman really was an interesting guy. We'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. But Larry Higgins and I wrote an article in an arthroscopy journal, actually, on value-based healthcare over 100 years, with Michael Porter on the other end, who wrote this great book called Redefining Healthcare. Codman was reviled in his day because of these kinds of cartoons. He drew a balloon there that says the shoulder, and the banner says the end result idea, which was the beginning of value-based care. And I put value on that because that's what he was talking about. But what's interesting now, if you talk about that, and the problem we have is, who are we creating value for? Who are all the stakeholders here? So are they the patients? Is it the industry? By industry, I mean the vendors and et cetera. Our shareholders, is it the hospital, our surgeons, others like the government? Who's really capturing the value, and at the expense of whom? And Porter introduced a concept of zero-sum game. There's only so much available, and there are winners and losers. You win, this guy loses, or vice versa. And if we think about it that way, that's just not a good equation. So here's a picture of Michael and I in front of Codman's life, the mural of Codman's life that I put on the wall outside my office because they were going to put it in the basement at the Mass General Hospital. It's actually outside the office now that Bassam's in. If Bassam is on the Zoom and watching, I wonder if he looks at it at all. But it's a fascinating story I'll come to in a minute. But from this, I came up with my own value-based agenda in how I did things. And that had to do with innovation. We'll talk about what the heck that is in a minute, which is predicated on measurement, which is also applied in my case to new methods and new technologies inside the organization and outside. I'll talk about that as well. Improve your care delivery and experience. Bend the experience curve because you reduce errors. Patients suffer for our learning curve. Bend the cost curve to create value. Improve efficiency and access to care. Be profitable. Think margin, not revenue. Sustaining an innovation requires that it's affordable. Align with stakeholders. So the more people that you benefit, the patient, the insurer, the hospital, others, the more successful you're going to be with whatever innovation you have. Risk stratify. Avoid comparing apples and oranges. We can't compare complex problems to simple problems. And unfortunately, the CPT coding and the rest of it does that all the time. It's not fair. Reduce unnecessary care because it leaves more resources available for the necessary care. That's the story of ASCs. Integrate care and manage resources to scale in innovation, and learn from others' examples of innovation and avoid their mistakes. And most of us are too busy to do that. We're too busy doing day-to-day things to pay attention to the opportunity to learn. And that's what one business guy called return on luck, that you have the luck enough to see something, but you're too busy to pay attention. Can you do all of this in your hospital, in your clinic, and in your practice? Do you have time and bandwidth to do it? And the answer is probably not. So this is the first time I'm giving this lecture in the United States. I gave this to begin with in a different form, slightly less complex, in Singapore. That's a picture of beautiful Singapore there. And I asked the question, what is an innovation? So let me share with you what at least one person thinks. This is from an article, Innovation in Surgery, a Historical Perspective, published in the Annals of Surgery. And there's a guy named Thomas Krummel. I'll talk about him more in a minute. He really is a surgeon innovator. He said, innovation is a broad term meaning introduction of a new method or ideas. Innovation may be a new technology, technique, or combination. Research does not equal innovation. A very, very important concept. Only a handful of academic centers have a surgical innovation center. I don't know if this place does, but that's what he wrote. Surgical innovation is fundamental to surgical processes and has significant health policy implications. Historically, individual surgeons drive innovation. I'll show you why he's correct in the study that we did at Harvard Business School. Surgeons and hospitals often resist innovation due to commitment to the status quo and a risk-averse stance. Innovation has historically been inconsistently supported, and technological innovations have scaled mostly outside of healthcare and surgery, come later to those areas. The place of innovation is important, where you do it. I'll talk about that as well. And healthcare, and I love this quote, healthcare has been described as the most entrenched change-averse industry in the USA. And some health systems may have a surgical culture which overemphasizes the past, right? That's an academic medical center. We'll talk about the diffusion of technology in a minute. So when you look at his concepts of innovation, there's disruptive innovation where you have to displace an incumbent that's there. So there's resistance. Either ego, there's a resistance, or economically, there's a resistance. But that resistance makes it very difficult to scale. And so these things usually happen in big, broad steps that have been developed elsewhere and then come to academic medical centers later. And a sustaining change really just maintains the status quo. It's just changing the colors on the devices or redesigning like golf clubs almost in many cases. So all of these different types of innovations exist, and I'm not going to go through the different ones there. But the interesting thing is when you look at these, the ones with the green check marks are the ones that really make a significant impact. And the ones with the red are kind of derivative. They don't really change much. And I would submit to you that most of what I see day in and day out is red, not green. Because they're easy. They're low-hanging fruit. They don't disrupt things for people. People are comfortable with them. So Thomas Crummell is the emeritus director of the Stanford Bayer Center for Biodesign. I never met him. I've just read the work that he's done, and I want to share some things with you that may resonate. He said, a scientist seeks an understanding, an inventor seeks a solution, and an innovator seeks an application. An entrepreneur seeks independence, autonomy, and control to maximize the likelihood of a success in a risky, that is a defined, and uncertain, ill-defined venture, and that sounds a lot like a surgeon. Every day you innovate in the operating room. You ad lib, right? You're creating. Now, hopefully you're creating because you have a learning curve that knows not to make a mistake, but that's what you do. And he went on to say that surgeons ignore technology advancement at their own peril. His articles, if you are interested, and I'll show how to get to it if you want, I put up on Codman Shoulder Society, which is kind of an organization I created for the intersection between business and healthcare and what we do. He wrote an article entitled Innovation Within a University Setting, and he said culture. He said these great quotes. First of all, this is Atul Gawande here, and this quote was attributed to him, but it was actually William Thomas who said this. Culture strangles innovation in the crib. That's what he thought about an academic medical center. And innovation is a change in something established. I already said that. The culture of an organization dramatically affects the innovation potential. And when you consider that human knowledge doubles every 12 months, and frankly, faster than that with AI, much, much faster, interdepartmental collaboration is essential for innovation. How many of you really have the opportunity to collaborate cross departments? You know how hard that is with the IRB and with cost centers and everything else? That's what really makes a difference. And you'll see what I'm talking about shortly. And it was Peter Drucker who said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. He was a great management guru. So what are the sources of innovation? So the Codman Shoulder Group is a group of experts. And in the spirit of Codman, Codman said, give me something that's different for this chance of being better. I mean, that's what an innovator would say. And so I asked the membership to list for me what they thought were the most important innovations in shoulder surgery in the last half century. And these are ranked in order of the frequency of what they said. And as you can see at the top here, not surprisingly, by the way, this is published in this book by Rockwood and Matson. I'll probably violate trademarks and put the chapter on my website eventually. But the obvious thing here, and by the way, this is a question of what's known and what's believed. The obvious thing here is the top of the list, which I'll show you in a minute. This guy here, Ozan Varal, was a NASA scientist, and he wrote a great book you might be interested in called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. He pointed out what we already know. Our tendency towards skewed judgment partially results from the confirmation bias we all have. We undervalue evidence that contradicts our beliefs, and we overvalue evidence that confirms them, right? People are uncomfortable being told they're wrong. But Christian Gerber once said to me that I am 100% certain that half of what I'm teaching you now is wrong. I just don't know which half. And we don't tell that to our students. So what do I know? What do I believe? And number one is reverse prosthesis here, which has changed the landscape for anybody doing this. And each specialist probably has their own particular idea of what that might be. And we'll talk about that a little more. Gerber also pointed out that we take most of these innovations for granted. And when I was at your stage in my education, we didn't have a lot of these things. So CT scans, MRIs, they're all taken for granted. Anesthesia improvements. Look at this list. Bone anchors, no big deal. But when I was learning, we didn't have a lot of these things. And boy, what a difference that is. Now, if you look at the diffusion of a technology, that's the blue curve there. There's enthusiasm, there's early experience, there's people standing on the podium who are experts telling you what they believe. You're adopting a new technology. You can put different things in this. And then the evidence starts to come out and enthusiasm drops and it goes down. This is what a lot of companies do. They release products that rise and fall. And at the end of the day, they're fulfilling their obligation to the shareholders. But if you look at something like reverse replacement, the journey is like the yellow line. it scales. Now, how does something scale and why does it scale? And how does it makes a big difference because it scales. These are all the different examples of modifications of what Grammont came up with that have scaled. Now, they're not disruptive per se. His was disruptive, but we'll talk about him more in a minute and his trials and tribulations for bringing this to the marketplace. But clearly, this is a key. Now, the question is, where does innovation happen? Me personally, I think academic medical centers belong to the right of the curve. And that is because they are what they are. They're late adopters or they're resistors because of economics, because of concerns for risk to patients and things like that. Many of them don't have a clear process to vet new technology so well. So this is a graph Gerber gave me. Now, in the vertical is health you create for your patient, and in the horizontal is money. So where real innovation happens, typically disruptive that scales, is in the steep part of the curve. And where derivative innovations happen is in the flat part of the curve. And most of what we get day in and day out that you see at the academy or wherever you look is on the flat part of the curve. Okay? Most are sustaining innovations, are not disruptive. So if you look here at cross-linked polyethylene, which came out of our lab at Mass General, or reverse replacement, these were very, very disruptive, tremendous value created from them. But then you look at the derivatives of the modifications of these, and these are kind of derivatives. They're not making a big difference. But the market's growing and they're generating revenue and et cetera, and maybe nuanced improvements. So if you look at really what everybody wants to do who's an innovator, the technology adoption and life cycle of a product really depends on crossing this chasm from those who are enthusiastic and those who are innovators. And Evan, Eric, you're probably in the yellow or the green there, right? To the rest of everybody. And so to make this jump, you have to have an easier adoption, not a major process change, lower cost and higher value, okay? And we can't sustain these things unless we achieve this kind of a value. So Grammont was over here. People scaled it. This was Walsh and Boileau, what they did. This is Mark Frankel. This is Biliani and Flato at the time they did theirs. And then Christian Gerber and I created actually the second reverse replacement that was ever released in the United States after the Grammont prosthesis came in 2004. It's no longer being used much, to tell you the truth. So I'm happy to say that we've gotten better. We realized that we didn't make something as it was somewhat derivative. Now, if you look back at people that have nothing to do with shoulder surgery per se, Sir John Charnley and William Harris, you would probably agree that these people were visionary innovators and disruptive. But you would think, well, these are very expensive. They created these expensive technologies. It costs a lot more money to put a hip in somebody, and then hip replacements are expensive and such. But you'd be interested to see in the Journal of Arthroplasty here that cross-linked polyethylene actually reduces overall cost because of durability and reduction of revisions. But here's the thing. The value that's created is time dependent. And so the money that's spent early on in the process by the hospital to pay for these that may compromise their margin is realized by the patient downstream. So how do you reconcile that with your fiscal health? It's a real ethical dilemma, I think. Now, if we get on to innovators here, Reinhold Gons basically created femoroacetabular impingement concept and hip preservation. Right? He did that towards the end of his career with no research money and no lab and no grants. So what happens here is so much more important than what may happen in the lab. It starts here first anyway, and much of what Einstein did were thought experiments. Paul Grammont was very widely, disrespected for this concept that had failed over and over again by others. And frankly, by the time this scaled in the United States, he had already had a stroke and was aphasic. So he didn't benefit a lot from this, but he changed the world for those of us who do shoulder surgery. So when you look at this and you ask the question, who has the DNA to innovate? And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. It's not the DNA, it's the behavior. Do you have the perseverance and the behavior? Now, some of this is because in the olden days, the regulatory barriers and the hospital barriers were much less than what they are now, okay? So when Codman wrote the first book in English on the shoulder and a book that he wrote about hospital efficiency, he also created the first anesthesia record, the first book in English on the shoulder, the first tumor registry, and the first use of radiography for fractures. In fact, he never had any children, and it's generally believed that he sterilized himself in the process because he didn't understand what X-rays did to your, to your ability to reproduce. Neer is well known for all the things he's done with fracture care, with with a shoulder replacement, et cetera. He also did many things outside the shoulder, and I already talked about Paul Grammont. Now, there's an award that is becoming sort of the Nobel of orthopedics. It was named in the honor of Dominique Meyer, who is Christian Gerber's junior partner. Dominique was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant innovator who unfortunately passed too early from ALS. And so Gerber founded this award in his honor, and it's an international award. I was privileged to be on the first two award panels for judges representing AAOS, but judges from around the world were involved. And so this was for the lifetime discovery and innovation disrupting orthopedics. You had to be alive, and you had to spend a career doing this, and you had to have a voting panel from around the world decide. And Gans was the first person selected because of his work for femoroacetabular impingement. Look at his title: Hip Preservation Surgery, Breaking the Rules. Okay? Can you break rules where you are? How's that go over with your department and your chairman and your institution, the IRB? So he said in retrospect when he presented his work, innovation is barely possible without breaking the real rules. Curiosity and lateral thinking are more helpful than follow-up studies and meta-analyses. Teamwork is indispensable to get a project going and bring it to maturity. And I was privileged to work with motivated teams. Okay. So this idea came from Europe and scaled to the US, and the rest is history. And all these people here who are early adopters helped shape it and scale it after Paul Grammont had the idea and persevered through all the criticism that he received. Now, let's just take a moment and look at innovators who changed treatment paradigms. And there are many that probably are not on this list. And I know we have trauma surgeons and pediatric orthopedic surgeons here and such who might add others. But of course, we talked about Charnley and Gans and Grammont, Watanabe for arthroscopic surgery, Christian Gerber for all the concepts as he brought us, innovating our understanding of rotator cuff pathology. He won a Kappa Delta Award for bench to bedside for that. Most of you probably don't have any idea who Lanny Johnson was. He created modern arthroscopy. He invented the motorized shaver, shared that patent with someone else. He had multiple patents in arthroscopy. Dick Kaspari created most of the concepts and instruments that we use in arthroscopy now. He passed. He was really a brilliant innovator. And I bet none of you know who created the knotless anchor. It was a guy named Ray Thal, who's in private practice in Reston, Virginia. And that patent was owned by Mitech. And then, of course, most of you probably know Arthrex produces those anchors now, but they didn't have the original idea. It was Ray. Now, the fascinating thing is when you look at where were these people, and I don't know a lot about the ones that were older. And again, even in the academic world, it was a different regulatory environment. Many of these people were private practice. Most people think Bill Harris was full-time. He was private practice, and that was sponsored by industry. So the context in which you do this, the place in which you do this, the freedom you have to do this may be somewhat unfettered by where you are. At least it's an idea. More innovators here, Gilles Walsh and Pascal Boulot for their concepts in virtual reality and arthroplasty and Latarjet and other procedures, and Joe Ionati, who many of you probably know, who's just an absolutely brilliant scientist. So many more. Well, these guys were mostly private practice, and Joe is a lifer academician. And in the arthroscopic world, the innovation of dexterity, technology, convictions for what we do, there's a long list here, and these are just a few of them. I mentioned Lanny Johnson, but Laurent Lafosse, who basically introduced us to nerve surgery arthroscopically, and Steve Snyder, who brought so many different devices here, and every single one of these is in private practice. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about innovators is several things. Number one, they tend to grow together. They compete with each other and learn from each other. Every generation has these people that argue with one another. The really good ones are innovative in the process. The other ones are egocentric. But there's this ratio between questions and answers. And individuals who ask more questions than answers are the most innovative people. The people who would tell you all the answers they have for everything that you want to know are not likely to be innovative. Now, this picture was taken in 1995 and was shown at the 6th Congress of the International Shoulder Elbow Society in Helsinki, Stockholm. And Gerber gave that to me. So part of what I think about when I'm learning, and part of what you should think about, is what is your network? What is your network of people that can help you in your desire to understand things? And it's interesting. Network effects are really important. Next to compounded interest, it's the most important thing that you do that there is in business. Building a network isn't just about the number of people you meet, but it's the number you introduce others to. It's power of compounded interest. And I can't tell you how important that is and how important that's been in my life. Now, back to organizations. This isn't from me. This was authored by, I can't remember where I got this, which article is from. But large organizations tend to hire top management teams selected based on delivery skills, their management skills, not their disruptive skills. Established firms do well with incremental innovations. In clinical care, I'm not talking about in the lab, inventing, understanding RNA messaging or inventing drugs or things like that. I'm talking about what you and I do. Smaller organizations tend to have leaders selected based on disruptive skills who know how to think differently. Smaller firms do better with radical change. That's just kind of how it goes. Now, you might wonder about this. This is an article from Nature. It's entitled Disruptive Science Has Declined and No One Knows Why, based on a citation of 45 million scientific manuscripts, which showed this puzzling trend, that the proportion of publications that send a field in a new direction has plummeted over the past half century. Why is that? Well, back to Clayton Christensen. He wrote this article and he wrote this book that's fantastic, The Innovator's DNA. And he created a methodology for looking at innovation in the for-profit world. And this was all about how organizations would find people who were innovative. How does my organization find innovative people? Now, I don't know about you, but I wonder about this in my organization. Are we always hiring innovative people, or are we hiring the most local person who's the least expensive, who can do more cases and create more RVUs? If we're going to call ourselves innovative, that should be part of what we do. That was easier to do when economics weren't such a problem now, but it is a problem. And so, Clayton Christensen asked, will disruptive innovations cure healthcare? There's an article he wrote in Harvard Business Review, and wrote this book on the innovator's prescription, which I've read more than once. Now, I'm going to get to the research that we've done. It was based on his work. His career was based on studies to identify who has the potential to innovate and disrupt. He said that each year, 50 million new businesses start. Innovation is the lifeblood of a global economy. And the methodology he used was an analysis of 2,500 innovators, proven innovators like you see here, and 15,000 executives in 75 countries. And from that, he concluded the following. It's not a genetic trait, but a modifiable behavior. It's not nature, it's nurture. Nurturing how to think. There are 5 key factors for real innovators, and in order of importance. Number 1 is questioning. Do you question enough to puncture the status quo? Do you have time even to ask questions? Do you observe with high intensity, or you just move from thing to thing to thing? Do you have a network to create diverse connections like I just showed? Is experimenting possible for you? And to what degree is it a risk for your patients to do it? And most importantly, associational thinking is linking ideas that are not directly connected. And for that, you need a broader view. And most of you, as you become specialists, will find that you narrow your view more and more and more, and you become more focused on one thing, because that's what we do. We're specialists. And that hurts your ability to innovate, because sometimes the brilliant idea over here never gets over here where it has more impact. And so what does your culture allow is the question I would ask. So this is Forbes magazine, and every year they publish the world's most innovative companies based on some of these metrics. And you can see, I think this is 2024, some of these companies. But the problem with this is the for-profit world. So when you look at what Christensen calls the innovation premium, that's based on the market cap divided by the net present value of a company. And the net present value is the value of the cash flows and projected income. So it's the expectation that you're going to do really meaningful things. Well, how do we do that in a hospital system? We just do RVUs in dollars. And frankly, it's very difficult in orthopedics to measure innovation premium. Really, and is it your H index? I just told you that research isn't necessarily innovation. Or is it the achievements you win and the awards you win? Maybe. So I was very interested in this. And so I collaborated with Susanna Galani here, who works in the value-based healthcare group, which was created by Michael Porter. And the working title of our study is Physician Perception of Innovation Culture in an Academic Medical Center using the methodology of the innovator's DNA. We're going to shorten that title. It's a little complicated. But it was predicated on these ideas. Innovation in healthcare is essential for improving patient outcomes, operational efficiency, and cost effectiveness. So the purpose of this study was to assess the individual innovation characteristics of orthopedic surgeons in a leading academic orthopedic department and their perception of their organization's innovation culture. 56 orthopedic surgeons participated. That was 100% of this department. And there were 2 validated surveys that we licensed from the Christensen Institute. One is called the Discovery and Delivery Survey, and the other one is an Innovation Characteristic Survey. And this is what they look like. People are either discovery or delivery people. And you can actually come up with numerical numbers, and this is cleverly camouflaged. You don't have what's called a Hawthorne effect. And you'll find out what people think about themselves, which is why I asked you, are you an innovator or not? And if you take this questionnaire, you'll find out kind of what you think about yourself. So what are we mostly in this particular organization? And then the survey for innovation looks at your organization in the context of people, processes, and philosophies, and has another cleverly camouflaged survey that has numeric values that allow you to then determine, are you high or low, or is your organization high or low on the scale? So the 30,000-foot view so far, and we're in the 3rd or 4th iteration of this paper that we're writing, is the following. Number one, innovation, high discovery score individuals in an academic medical center is driven by the individual, not by the organizational culture. You either are or you're not, or you become. Number two, innovative individuals who have a high discovery score are less likely to be contributors to the organizational culture. Ooh, the chairman probably doesn't like them because they're not go along, get along people. They're constantly looking outside. And, you know, in my organization, there's 74 pages of conflict of interest. So if we're doing that, we better not violate the conflict of commitment, which is to do our job and teach and create a lot of RVUs and all of that. Interesting. Innovators, those who have a high discovery score tend to have a more external orientation, like I just said. And we observed that the low surgeons' perception of innovation of their organization. I'm sorry. We observed that from the top to the bottom of the organization, from the highest level to the lowest level, they scored the organization in which we work as not a facilitator for innovation. However you want to, and we didn't, by the way, we didn't clarify what's innovation. We let them think, what is an innovation? Could be anything. Could be, I want to change the way I see patients. I want to, whatever. It was all encumbered. So our findings agree with Herzlinger's assertion that she wrote about in 2006, that academic medical centers tend to have rigid hierarchies, regulatory constraints, and are risk averse, and they affect the culture for innovation. And there may be a need for AMCs to focus on bridging that gap between what surgeons' view of themselves and the tendencies of the institution in terms of being a barrier to innovation. Why is this important? So let's consider evidence for a minute. This is a book written by Mohit Bhandari, the world's expert on evidence-based medicine and orthopedics. And so we all know about levels of evidence, right? Would it surprise you to know that the levels of evidence in orthopedics aren't that high? Right? How many prospective randomized studies have any of you ever done, let alone read? I'll let that sink in for a minute. So this was an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2003 by McGlynn and colleagues. And it looked at different specialties and the variation in evidence-based care. And 45% of patients did not receive care according to the best evidence in terms of the hierarchy of that evidence. And so you can see here the best performers were those treating coronary artery disease. And that's really been the way it is. Cardiothoracic surgeons do a much better job than we do in terms of being able to get high level of evidence. So orthopedics and shoulder surgery doesn't even rank in this list, at least it hasn't. And there's a guy named John Ioannidis, who's probably one of the most cited scientists in the world, who's at Stanford, who wrote an article about healthcare research entitled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And it just so happened he was our visiting professor a month or so ago. And he gave this talk, Reproducible and Useful Biomedical Research. And I think this concept that is research innovation or not. So when you look at his article here, and you look at some of the reasons why research is problematic, you can see all of these reasons why we go round and round and don't produce meaningful research, including confirmation bias, study designs that have low statistical power, all these different issues, fragility in the study. And another article he wrote is why most clinical research is not useful. And these are all the reasons why. This is the feature. These are the questions asked. Was it the right question in the first place? Was it pragmatic? Did it have any meaningfulness? Did it change anything? Was there transparency to it, et cetera? And even when we have good evidence, they looked at 1,394 studies to identify this, and they found that the quality of the evidence was very low through most of these. And we also found that subjective interpretation of even the best medical evidence is viewed this way. Experts often subjectively disagree on how they interpret the same evidence provided in a high-level research project and the recommendations they derive from it, because our egos get in the way, or our confirmation bias gets in the way. And that also affects our ability to innovate. And even large language models are not immune to this. They basically, you probably heard of how AI can hallucinate. It doesn't know how to differentiate between really good research and really crappy research. And it just curates all that and puts it all together. And sometimes it even makes up references that are fake. So all of this has to be put into the pot and stirred around if you're even thinking about innovation. So I'm about to finish up, but I want to give you two stories. And these are, when I went to business school, I loved case-based studies. So I don't know how many of you know what Imascap was. Those of you who have done shoulder surgery probably don't know what Blueprint is. So Blueprint is a digital technology that is now used with one of the vendors. And many of the other vendors all have digital tools for planning. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That if you're going to build a building, the architect should design it first. So when you go to the operating room, you go, I think that goes right about there and that'll be perfect. Remember what I said about value being time dependent? Everybody is great until about 5 million cycles. And at that point, the errors in the biomechanics of what you've accomplished can lead to failures of the glenoid and things of that nature that you thought were doing great because you last saw the patient 2 years ago, when in fact they come in 5 years, 6 years, failed. So Imascap was the beginning of this. And not to take anything away from anybody else, but Imascap began in a little place in France called Brest, France. That's where Brest, France is, okay? And this was a privately held company founded in 2009. And the mission was real-world application of augmented surgery, of virtual reality planning and everything, long before this really came into the market. And they got all these awards, and the French government supported it. Context, support of innovation. There are many countries that give grants that support it with low or very little interest rates. And the leaders of this were Gilles Valls, Pascal Bourlot, and Jean Chouy, who was the engineer. And they asked me to come on board in 2016. Why? Because I built a friendship with them and knew them for decades. Remember what I said before? Business is built based on relationships. Plus, I was, I think, the key to the US market, which of course is the wealthiest market in the world. And so when we went along and did this, we came up with all these ideas and 3D modeling, which now you see all over the place, but this was automated sequencing, which is really important. Why is that important? Because lower cost, faster, more reliable. So AI image processing, computer vision with 3D reconstruction, computer-assisted planning for navigation, patient-specific implants, all software engineering. And these are some of the things we created, including how components would fit, what would be the consequences of placing them there. We had a whole plan and sequence here. First, patient-specific implants, then augmented glenoids, et cetera, et cetera. And we had 3 phases. Phase 1 was develop better guidance for glenoid placement, which was really critical to durability of the glenoid. Phase 2 was humerus and reverse planning and guide development to facilitate humerus placement because of notching and all these problems that had come with the glenoid prosthesis. And phase 3 was implant development itself, actually developing implants in a virtual world before you come up with prototypes and all the rest of it. And how would you fund this? Well, it was privately funded, because when they asked me to join, and it was my pleasure and privilege to join, they asked how much money I could put into it. And the secret of my success was I didn't tell my wife, okay? So we had a licensing agreement, which really helped us a lot. And we sort of managed our way through this without diluting by getting venture capital or private equity and all those other players involved. And this is just a graph showing how you strategize this to market maturity versus the impact and planning. And I'm not going to go into that. But what's interesting is when you look at our early designs here, which was a concept for a metaphyseal fit stem, and I'm not going to go into why we did that, that would become this, which is now one of the leading stems in the market. And these were some of the ways we did the designing. When we looked at the need to correct version, because we thought it would be better for the mechanics of the joint, that became this. And this happened decades beforehand with other companies. And in 2017, this was what they called, I didn't come up with this, they called this the Dream Team. This was at a meeting we had in Val d'Isere. And you can see everybody here, George Athwal is one of the younger members of the team, brilliant engineer. And we came up with patient-specific guides. And the fascinating thing is, here's the economics of this. You wonder, how does anything scale? Nothing scales unless somebody's paying for it. And so Wright and Tournier merged, $3.3 billion. Then Wright acquired Imascap for almost $90 million. And then Stryker bought Wright for $5.6 billion. And Blueprint, which is now the trade name for this, became the platform for most of the enabling technology that's used there now. And that includes these kinds of things where you can subtract metal and other things to be able to see what you're doing, to do revision surgery. It was, for a period of time, the basis for mixed reality until Microsoft decided to cancel the HoloLens project, but mixed reality will probably be reborn again somewhere. It was the basis for embedding AI into planning so that we would advise surgeons to not make errors. So if you show a particular geometry in 3D here and you have information about the patient, then AI is based on experts doing planning over and over and over again. And it tells you the percent of experts that would do one thing versus another thing. AI doesn't give you one answer. It narrows the scope. And you would call someone and say, hey, what should I do with this? Well, that's embedding AI into the planning tool. AI can auto plan. So instead of having to go through which and this and that, whatever, once you put in your parameters you want, or you default to the parameters we give you, in about 90 seconds or less, it will auto plan the procedure and give you the optimum configuration. So at the end of the day, this resulted in this fantastic organization that is far and away the leading player in the world of shoulder arthroplasty. And it's been my privilege to be part of it and to watch it happen. And that's how things happen. That's how things scale. Now, the other one, most of you, anybody here not know what ViewMedi is? No? You guys use ViewMedi? Okay, so let me tell you the story of ViewMedi, because I was also early to that, lucky enough. And this is a great example of, to be successful, you have to show up, okay? So the founder is a really smart guy named Roman Giverts. And Roman basically approached me. And before I get to that, let me give you some context. The early years in the landscape of business, of education and the internet, et cetera, included the birth of videotapes in 1950, PowerPoint 1998, iMovie 1999, Adobe Premiere in 1991. We had Blockbuster, which gave way to Netflix, and then YouTube got bought, and this is the growth, right? And then we had Facebook, and then we had LinkedIn, and then we had Doximity. This was the growing landscape of the difference of the internet. But in 2008, when ViewMedi started, it wasn't really that far. And in fact, this is an email that I highlighted. I think it's public domain. Roman sent it to me. And this is what I got. I got this email in my inbox, March 3rd, 2008. Inquiry by UC Berkeley alumni RE Surgical Video website. And he introduced himself and he said, me and a few other alumni are building an educational video website where orthopedic surgeons can view, upload, and discuss surgical videos. He said, would you have a few minutes to speak with me on the phone about this project? Or if you're attending the academy, it was in San Francisco that year, perhaps we could meet. Now, he sent this out to many people, and the only one who showed up and spent any time with him was me. Okay? Now, this was the vision. Innovate an approach for surgeon education, central place for all surgeon education videos. The academy was doing it, but not particularly well and charging you for it. Industry, hospital, meeting partners, and a highly engaged community. Immediately, we had all these people jump on board. The first video you see here in the bottom was mine. There are 60,000 on the website now. We're growing at over 20,000 a year. And here's what he said. He said, on January 28, 2008, we bought the domain, viewmedi.com. On April 30th of 2008, we filed our articles of incorporation. That means we built the product, bought the domain, and met you, me, before we even formed the company. When I say we started the company when I was still a student living in my college apartment, we really did. Okay? And I showed up, and I didn't know anything about business at the time. I just became mentor in residence to some degree. And we did all these different things. We got together, we showed people videos, we got them interested in ViewMedi, and we realized this wasn't going to scale. And then we had a whole approach that was predicated on how the market had gone along, not probably a lot different than what Netflix had thought about. And these dashboards for how we were doing the videos and everything. And I want to just share with you, this is off the internet, but it's actually very good consideration. The top 12 reasons why startups fail, and why was this a success? And it's largely to credit to Roman and my input to help him to some degree, but it was really him. So first of all, do you run out of money? Well, we bootstrapped this. It was amazing. We didn't have any funding from outside. And I don't have time to go into the business model, but I can tell you it was perfectly timed. We saw a need. We grew fast. We knew the customer. That was you to start with. And orthopedics was the beachhead for this. You always have to start with one thing. We didn't have any real competition. It was free to MDs, just the same way that Facebook was, and et cetera. We had the right team doing it, although we had a lot of trouble early on and had to get rid of people, and that was a big problem. We grew quickly. We had a great product. All our customers told us that. Everybody was happy with it. We didn't have any need to pivot or have problems there, and it was a passion project, okay? And so if you look at the scaling of some other educational sites, you can see how much these have grown. And if you look at the landscape, which really isn't a competitive landscape, educational tech in the vertical and healthcare networks, Umedi is actually a combination of both. And the others are more one thing versus another, okay? And so the growth of videos, the growth of participants you can see here, and it's scaled into multiple specialties, okay? And the number of videos growth is here. And I can't share the financials with you, but they're quite remarkable. So I told my colleagues, I said, there are 20 different ways to do any case, and you can watch them in one place, Umedi. Actually, the problem we have now is we have so many videos, we have to infiltrate AI into this to find the things you want to find because there's so much material there. But the pretty cool thing about it is you can watch it at home, you can watch it in the operating room, you can watch it on the couch, easy access. And, and that's my story. And so anybody who's interested, I'll leave this up if you want to look, maybe the QR code will work for you if you want to scan it, or I'm happy to give this information to you. The Boston Shoulder Institute, which I didn't talk about, is a patient portal for education. It drives business. It's an incredibly important business model because when people get what they want, which is confidence and reassurance, because you educate them about the risks and the benefits, you automatically differentiate yourself from others. And in fact, it was Michael Porter who said, if you really want to be successful, be different. In the Codman Shoulder Society, really the name shoulder is a misnomer. We talk about shoulder a bit, but we do a lot more talking about other things that are important to you. So for example, our annual meeting focuses on other things like career development. Last year, our annual meeting was on physician-hospital financial relationships and the importance of the value physicians can create for the hospital, even though the hospital oftentimes puts us on the menu, not at the table. So that's it. Thanks. I'm happy to take any questions, and I hope that was informative.